Have you ever noticed how, even in silence, your mind never stops? And how, at certain times, does it seem to work against you? Thoughts that come back without asking permission. Memories that weigh more at night. Worries that repeat themselves like an echo that does not shut up. What if the biggest battle of your life isn't happening around you, but inside you, right now? There is an invisible place where decisions are made before you even act, and few realize that this is where everything starts to work out, or falling apart. There are moments when time seems to slow down, and you find yourself trapped inside your own head, revisiting mistakes, imagining scenarios, feeling a weight you can't explain. It's like something is out of place, but you can't pinpoint what. The mind fills, the heart tightens, and a silent question arises. Why is it so hard to find peace, even when everything seems to be fine on the outside? This cycle repeats itself day after day, as if there is a key that you have not yet found. But what if this key has always been close, hidden in something you've heard but never seen that way? There is a deep, almost forgotten spiritual principle that has the power to completely reorganize what happens inside you. It is not something complicated nor distant. It's simple, but it requires something that most avoid: real delivery. The Bible reveals that the mind is the center of everything. Romans 12:2 says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." This means that the change you seek doesn't start outside, it starts within. And perhaps what is lacking is not strength nor knowledge, but right direction. There is a way, and it is not common. He confronts, dismantles, and rebuilds, a path that Jesus taught, but that few truly apply. 2 Corinthians 10:5 states, "Bringing every mind captive to the obedience of Christ." This is more than a verse, it's a spiritual strategy. If you stay with me, something will start to change, not just in what you understand, but in what you feel. Because what will be revealed here is not theory. It's a living secret. And somehow, even today, your mind can finally find rest. On this path that we are starting together, you will discover how God works directly in your mind, bringing healing where there was confusion before, direction where there was doubt, and purpose where everything seemed meaningless. Each teaching reveals how thoughts can open spiritual doors, how to identify voices that do not come from God, and how to align your mind with the truth that sets you free. Real stories from the Bible will show that this is not theory, it is living transformation. As you move forward, something begins to happen inside. It's as if every word finds exactly the place where you need it most. Isaiah 26:3 declares, "Thou shalt keep in peace him whose mind is set on thee," and that peace begins to be built here. And if that message is already speaking to you, don't ignore it. By liking this video and subscribing to the channel, you help this word to reach other lives that also need this encounter with God. Now begins the part that many avoid facing, but that defines everything. Your mind is not just a place where thoughts pass. It is an active spiritual battleground, and the most impressive thing is that this war did not start today. From the beginning in Eden, the attack was never physical, it was mental. The serpent did not touch Eve, did not force her to do anything, only asked a question apparently innocent, but loaded with poison. Is this so that God said, "You shall not eat of every tree of the garden"? Genesis 3:1. Notice this carefully. The doubt entered before the mistake happened, and that's exactly how it still works. Thoughts arrive in a subtle, almost imperceptible way, questioning truths that you already know. Small distortions, internal phrases that seem to be yours, but that carry confusion, fear, and insecurity. And when you don't realize it, you start believing them. The battle never starts in the action. It starts with the acceptance of an idea. Maybe you've experienced it. a negative thought that appeared without warning, an insecurity that grew out of nowhere, an inner voice telling you that you won't make it, that it's not worth it, that nothing will change. And the most dangerous, when it is repeated so many times that it seems true. But there is something that needs to be clear within you today. Not every thought that crosses your mind comes from God. The enemy does not need to destroy your life at once. It starts by distorting what you think, because when the mind goes astray, the whole path changes. That is why protecting the mind is protecting your destiny. Now look at Job. He lost everything, absolutely everything. And yet the Bible says, in all this Job did not sin, nor did he fault God. Job 1:22. This means that even in the midst of chaos, he guarded his mind. He didn't let the pain distort his view of God. This is profound, because many resist on the outside, but have already been defeated on the inside. Surrendering your mind to God begins right here. Learning to identify what is not from Him. Not every thought deserves your attention. Not every voice deserves space within you. There is a spiritual vigilance that needs to be activated, where you begin to observe, filter, and confront what tries to settle in your mind. And maybe, as you listen to this, something is making sense inside. Maybe you're recognizing patterns, thoughts that have been repeating themselves for years. And if this is happening now, it is no accident. If this message touched you in any way, write Amen in the comments. Sometimes, a simple decision is the first step to taking back control of your mind. There is something that few realize. There is no point in trying to change life on the outside when the mind is still stuck inside. True transformation does not begin with visible attitudes, but with silent thoughts that no one sees. That's why so many people try to start over, change habits, make different decisions, and yet they feel trapped in the same place. Because the root remains intact. The renewed mind sees the world differently. Situations that once seemed impossible are beginning to take on new meanings. What once generated fear is now interpreted with faith. And this does not happen by human effort alone, but by a real encounter with God that changes the way of thinking. Look at Paul. Formerly known as Saul, he was determined, religious, and convinced. But his mind was out of line with the truth. He pursued what would later give meaning to his own life, until, in an unexpected encounter, everything changed. Acts 9:17 reveals this moment. Saul, brother, the Lord Jesus. He has sent me that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Notice the depth of it. Before any mission, before any purpose, something had to happen. He needed to see again. And perhaps this is exactly what is missing for many today. It's not strength, it's not courage. It is spiritual vision. It is to see life with a renewed mind. But this renewal does not happen all at once. It's not instantaneous. It is a continuous, daily, often silent process. It is replacing old thoughts with new truths. It is rejecting lies that have been accepted for years and beginning to align the mind with what God says. Ephesians 4:23 states, "And be renewed in the spirit of your mind." This shows that there is an internal work going on all the time. Every time you choose to think differently, react differently, remember the word instead of feeding fear, something begins to change within you. Small decisions generate great transformations. An aligned thought today can change a destiny tomorrow. A simple spiritual habit, such as meditating on the Word, can reprogram your mind in a profound way over time. And little by little, without realizing it, what you once dominated loses strength. That constant anxiety begins to subside. That insecurity that seemed permanent begins to disappear because the mind that exposes itself to the truth does not remain the same. Maybe you don't see everything changing around you yet, but something has already started inside you. And that's the beginning of everything. If that word is awakening within you, a real desire for change, write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." And leave your like on this video, because by doing so, you help this message reach other people who also need to renew their minds and really start over. There is a silent but decisive difference between listening to thoughts and recognize the voice of God. Because not everything that passes through your mind carries divine direction. Some ideas confuse, others pressure, others generate immediate fear. And if you don't learn to discern, you may end up following paths that were never prepared for you. That is exactly what happened to Samuel. As a young man, he heard a voice calling his name, but he didn't understand where it came from. He thought it was Eli, someone close, someone visible, until he was told to answer differently. And when he finally said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears," 1 Samuel 3:10, something changed. It wasn't just listening, it was to recognize. And here's a profound point. God speaks, but not always in the way you expect. His voice doesn't scream, it doesn't cause despair, it doesn't push you into rash decisions. God's voice brings clarity even when the scenario is not yet resolved. It brings peace even when everything around it seems uncertain. Now think with me. How many times have you made decisions based on haste, fear, or anxiety? How many times have you followed a thought that seemed urgent, but then realized that it only brought confusion? This reveals something important. The mind needs to be trained to discern. Jesus made this clear in John 10:27. "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." This means that there is a familiarity that is built. It's not something automatic, it's a relationship. The closer you get to God, the easier it becomes to recognize when He is the one speaking, and this sensitivity begins to develop in the details. Sometimes it is a thought that brings peace without explanation. Other times it is a direction that does not make logical sense, but touches deeply within you. And there are times when God speaks through the Word, confirming exactly what you needed to hear. But there are also voices that need to be rejected. Thoughts that diminish you, that generate constant fear, that take you away from faith. These do not come from God. Because God does not plant confusion in the minds of those He wants to lead. Discernment is learning to pause before reacting. It is not accepting any thought as truth. It is to observe what that thought produces within you, peace or restlessness, clarity or confusion, faith or fear. And perhaps, as you listen to this, you're starting to notice something different. Maybe you're understanding that not everything you felt until today was direction. Some things were distraction. And if you somehow feel like you need to hear God's voice more clearly in your life, keep it in your heart and turn it into a small attitude now. Write in the comments, "I want to hear your voice." Sometimes a simple phrase, made with sincerity, makes room for something new to start inside you. There are thoughts that don't go away. They remain, repeat themselves, and take deep root within the mind. And over time, they stop looking like just thoughts and become absolute truths. This is what the Bible calls strongholds. They are not visible, but they control decisions, emotions, and even the way you see yourself. They are built slowly, often from old pains, words that marked, experiences that hurt, and lies that were accepted without question. And the most dangerous thing is that these fortresses do not scream. They whisper every day. They say that you are not capable, that you will not change, that you have tried before and failed. They create an invisible prison where the mind gets used to living limited, even when God has already declared freedom. But there is one truth that needs to sink deep into you now. Every stronghold can be destroyed. Not by human strength, not by repeated attempt, but by the power of God working within the mind. 2 Corinthians 10:4 clearly reveals this. For the weapons of our warfare are not fleshly, but mighty through God, for the pulling down of strongholds. This means that there is a war going on, but there are also spiritual weapons capable of winning. And here comes a detail that changes everything. Before any external victory, there needs to be an internal victory. David understood this when he faced Goliath. While everyone saw a giant impossible to beat, David saw differently. He did not accept the narrative of fear. He didn't agree with what everyone was saying. And when he declared, "Thou comest unto me with a sword, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts," 1 Samuel 17:45, he had already won within the mind before the battle even began. This reveals something powerful. The way you think determines the way you fight. If the mind is dominated by fear, any challenge seems greater. But when the mind is aligned with God, even giants begin to lose strength. Identifying these strongholds requires attention. They are repetitive patterns, thoughts that always lead to the same place, feelings that arise with no apparent explanation, and breaking them requires decision. It is to confront the lie with the truth. It is to replace what limits you with what God says about you. And this process is not immediate, but it is real. Each time you reject a negative thought and choose to trust God, a crack forms in that stronghold. Each time you cling to the word instead of giving in to fear, something begins to crumble inside. If you are here so far, it is because something within you is being awakened. Maybe you're already identifying these strengths. Maybe you're realizing that you don't have to live stuck in these patterns anymore. And there is a moment prepared especially for you on this path. At the end, let's pray together, and that prayer can mark the beginning of a deep deliverance in your mind. So stay, because what is being built here is not just understanding, it is real transformation. There is a kind of peace that the world cannot offer, because it doesn't depend on what's going on around you. It is a peace that does not disappear when trouble comes, that is not shaken when the news changes, that does not break when everything seems out of control. And perhaps the most difficult thing to understand is this: it does not come from the absence of storms, but from the presence of God in the midst of them. Many people spend their entire lives trying to organize everything outside to finally feel peace inside. But the more they try to control it, the more they realize that something always slips away, and this generates a cycle of anxiety, worry, and mental fatigue. But God's peace works in a completely different way. It starts within, and then it achieves the rest. Paul understood this in a profound way. He wrote words that spanned generations while he was imprisoned, physically limited, surrounded by hardship. Even so, he declared, "And the peace of God, he will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Philippians 4:7. Notice this, it's not just a feeling of relief, it's a protection. The peace of God guards the mind, like an invisible shield that prevents chaos from entering. That changes everything, because it means that even when the problem doesn't go away, the mind doesn't have to be dominated by it. And Jesus showed this in an even more impactful way. In the midst of a real storm, with strong wind, violent waves, and desperate disciples, he was asleep, not because he was ignorant of the danger, but because his mind was completely at peace. And when he got up, he didn't panic. He simply scolded the wind. Mark 4:39 says, "And he awoke and rebuked the wind." The external storm was only silenced after the internal authority manifested itself. Now think about it. How many storms have robbed you of your peace lately? How many situations have occupied your mind, taken away your sleep, drained your energy? The difference is not only in what you face, but in how your mind reacts to what is in front of you. God's peace is available, but it needs to be accessed. And this happens when the mind stops feeding on fear and begins to stand in the presence of God. It's not ignoring problems. It's not allowing them to control your thoughts. And perhaps right now you are realizing that you need that peace more than ever. Not a fleeting peace, but something deep, constant, that remains even when everything around changes. If this makes sense to you, turn it into an attitude now. Declare in the comments, "Lord, I receive your peace." Write it as an act of delivery and leave your like, because by doing so, you help other people find that same peace that starts within and changes everything around. There is a force capable of completely reprogramming your mind, and it does not come from logic, nor from what the eyes can see. This force is called faith. And maybe you've heard this word all your life, but you still haven't realized what it really does inside you. Faith is not just believing in something good. It changes how you interpret everything around you. Without faith, the mind clings to what is visible. It calculates, limits, predicts the worst. But when faith comes in, something begins to rearrange itself inside. Situations that seemed definitive are no longer so. Fears that seemed real begin to lose strength. Because faith does not ignore reality, she sees beyond herself. Abraham is one of the most profound examples of this. The Bible says at Romans 4:18, "Who in hope believed against hope." This means that even when there were no more human reasons to believe, he chose to trust. Now think about it. It wasn't just an emotional decision. It was a mental position. He refused to accept natural limits as the final word, and it is exactly here that the mind begins to be transformed. Because we've all been conditioned to think based on what we see, what we feel, what's happened before. But faith breaks that pattern. It introduces a new way of thinking, where God becomes the center of interpretation. Hebrews 11:1 states, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for." That is, faith creates an internal base even before the external change happens. That's powerful, because it means that the transformation begins within before any sign appears outside. Maybe you're facing something right now that seems impossible to change. A situation that has been repeated so many times that his mind began to accept it as definitive. But faith enters exactly in these places, not to deny the problem, but to reposition your mind before it. And little by little, you start to think differently. Where there was fear before, confidence begins to emerge. Where there was doubt, expectation begins to be born. And this does not happen all at once, but each thought aligned with faith reconfigures your mind. Surrendering the mind to God goes through this, allowing faith to have more space than fear. It is choosing to believe even when there are no visible guarantees. It is trusting that God is at work even when everything seems to be at a standstill. And perhaps, as you listen to this, something inside you is being adjusted, as if a new way of seeing was beginning to emerge. This is no coincidence. If this message is already touching your heart in a real way, understand that this is already a sign that God is working in you now. And there is a simple way to make this word reach even more people. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. You become part of something bigger, taking this message to other lives that also need to renew their minds by faith. There are pains that do not appear in the body, but live hidden in the mind, influencing thoughts, decisions, and even the way you see life. Wounds that time has not healed, it has only silenced. Situations that are behind us, but have left deep marks inside you. And the most difficult thing is that many times, these wounds begin to distort your spiritual vision without you realizing it. You start to doubt more, to trust less, to always expect the worst. The mind becomes a heavy place where memories and emotions mix, creating a cycle that is difficult to break. And what few understand is that even spiritually strong people go through this. Elijah is living proof of this. A man who experienced miracles, who saw the power of God in a supernatural way, who overcame enormous challenges. But even so, it reached a point of emotional exhaustion. In 1 Kings 19:4 he says, "Enough, O Lord, now take my life. This is not just physical fatigue, it is a wounded soul speaking." Now notice something that changes everything. God didn't rebuke you. God did not correct him at that time. God took care of him. First, it restored his body, then his mind, and only then did he bring direction again. This reveals a profound principle. God does not ignore the pain that is within you. Psalm 147:3 declares, "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." This means that there is healing available, not only for what you have experienced, but for what it has generated within your mind. Surrendering your mind to God is also allowing him to touch those areas that you avoid. It's letting him into the difficult memories, the thoughts you've never shared, the emotions you've learned to hide. Because while these wounds are not treated, they continue to silently influence everything around them. And healing begins in a simple but profound way. It starts when you recognize that you need it. When you stop trying to solve everything on your own and allow God to take care of you from the inside out. Gradually, what once hurt begins to lose strength. That which once dominated your thoughts begins to dissipate. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened, but it does mean no longer being controlled by it. It is a restoration that takes place on the inside, bringing lightness, bringing peace, bringing a new way of thinking. And maybe, as you listen to this, someone has come to your mind, someone who is also wounded, someone who needs that same healing, someone who carries pain in silence. If this happened, don't ignore it. Write that person's name in the comments. Let's present these lives before God together, because when faith comes together, something powerful begins to happen. There is a point in the spiritual walk when everything begins to make sense, not because circumstances have changed, but because the mind has finally aligned with God's purpose. And when this happens, even what seemed unfair takes on a new meaning. Because an aligned mind doesn't just interpret life by what it sees, but for what God is doing behind the scenes. Jose lived this intensely, betrayed by his own brothers, sold, wronged, forgotten. Everything seemed out of place. Anyone in his position would have reason to revolt, to give up, or to entertain thoughts of bitterness. But Joseph chose something different. He kept his mind steady, even when everything around him said otherwise, and years later, looking back at his entire history, he declares something that reveals the level of alignment he has achieved. "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Genesis 50:20. This is more than forgiveness. It is spiritual understanding. It is to see the hand of God even in the most difficult moments. Now think about it in depth. How many situations have you experienced that still don't make sense? How many moments have you not understood, not accepted, maybe even questioned? The problem is not going through these phases. The problem is when the mind gets stuck only in pain and loses the ability to see the purpose. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the thoughts I think of you." This means that even when you don't understand, God already knows. There is a plan being built, even if you don't see it right now. But to live this purpose, the mind needs to trust before understanding. To surrender one's mind to God is to accept that not everything will be clear in the present moment, but still to choose to believe. It is to interpret difficulties not as the end, but as part of a larger process. And it completely changes the way you live, because when the mind is misaligned, any problem seems definitive. But when it is aligned with God, even challenges become purposeful. What used to generate revolt begins to produce growth. What seemed to be backwardness turns out to be preparation. And little by little, you begin to realize that your story is not out of control. There is a direction, there is care, there is a construction going on. and his mind, once confused, begins to find stability in this. This is the point where everything connects. Peace, faith, healing. Everything converges when the mind surrenders completely to God's purpose, because it is not just about living better, but about living with meaning. And when there is purpose, even difficult days carry value. Nothing happens by chance. If you have come this far, there is something being worked on within you now. And what comes next can deepen this transformation even further. Stay until the end, because this journey will still touch areas that you may never have fully surrendered, and that can change everything. There is a kind of silence that many avoid, because in it there are no distractions to hide what is really going on inside the mind. It is in this silence that thoughts get louder, that emotions come to the surface, that truths begin to appear. And maybe that's why so many people prefer constant noise, a busy mind, full time, anything that prevents this deep encounter with oneself. But what few realize is that many times God chooses silence to speak, not because he has walked away, but because he wants to be heard clearly. The problem is that a mind full of noise cannot perceive a soft voice. Elias lived this moment in a remarkable way. After facing intense challenges, he hoped to find God in grandiose manifestations. A strong wind passed, then an earthquake, then fire. Impressive signs, but God was not in any of them, until after all this came something almost imperceptible. And after the fire, a still small voice. Kings 19:12. It was there that Elijah recognized the real presence. This reveals something profound. God does not need intensity to manifest himself. He reveals himself in depth. And this depth is only accessed when the mind quiets down. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." This is not just advice. It is a spiritual key. Because while the mind is agitated, worried, accelerated, it cannot discern what comes from God. But when there is silence, something begins to line up. And it is not just about external silence, but internal. It's that moment when you stop, slow down, stop responding to everything immediately, stop feeding every thought that arises, and simply allows God to occupy that space. At first, it may seem uncomfortable. The mind tries to go back to the old pattern, tries to fill the void. But little by little, this silence ceases to be empty and becomes presence. It is in this place that the mind begins to reorganize itself. Thoughts that were confused begin to calm down. Emotions that were disordered find balance. And without realizing it, you start to feel something different. A clarity that does not come from you. A peace that does not depend on explanation. Because God does not cry out to be heard. He expects you to be willing to listen. And maybe what's missing isn't more answers, more information, or more attempts. Maybe it's just enough silence to realize that God is already speaking. There is a turning point in the spiritual journey that many ignore. Hearing the truth is not enough to transform the mind. It is obedience that activates change. Because while truth remains only knowledge, the old patterns continue to dominate. But the moment you decide to act, something begins to be reconfigured within you. The human mind tends to seek logic, security, guarantees. She wants to understand everything before she takes a step. But obedience to God often breaks just that. She calls for action before the full explanation. And it is at this point that many get stuck. Because obeying requires trust. Noah lived this reality in a way that defies any human understanding. God asked him to build an ark at a time when it had never rained. There was no reference, there was no external confirmation, there was no visible evidence that it made sense. Still, Genesis 6:22 says, "Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, he did so." He didn't question every detail. He didn't postpone waiting for more clarity. He obeyed. And that's exactly what transforms the mind, because each act of obedience breaks an old pattern and establishes a new one. Limited logic begins to lose strength, and trust in God begins to grow. Gradually, the mind stops depending only on what it sees and starts to focus on what God says. James 1:22 reinforces this directly, and be doers of the word, and not hearers only. This reveals that there is a risk in just listening. You can get emotional, agree, even feel that something made sense. But if there is no action, nothing really changes. Perhaps you have already received clear directions at some points in your life. That feeling that I should do something different, make a decision, change a path, but for some reason you put it off, and over time it became more distant. Obedience rescues this. It activates what was stopped, and more than that, it strengthens your spiritual mind, because each time you obey, you prove to yourself that you can trust God, and that confidence begins to shape your thoughts. It doesn't mean it will be easy. Often, obeying goes against what you feel at the moment. It goes against fear, against insecurity, against doubt. But that's exactly where the growth lies. And maybe, right now, something is coming to your mind. A direction you've realized before, a decision you know you need to make but haven't made yet. If this happened, don't ignore it. That word didn't come to you by chance. God finds ways to speak, to insist, to touch exactly where He needs to. And if it moved you in any way, turn it into a small act now. Write in the comments, I trust in God. Sometimes a simple decision, even in silence, can mark the beginning of a new direction. There is a place where the mind finally finds rest, but it is not a physical place. It does not depend on external silence or the absence of problems. It is a spiritual environment that few learn to access constantly, the presence of God. And when the mind enters this place, something changes in a profound way, almost imperceptible at first, but absolutely real. Many people seek stability by trying to organize their lives around them, solve everything, control every detail. But the mind remains restless, because true rest does not come from control. It comes from presence. It is there that thoughts slow down, that anxiety loses strength, that the heart finds security even without complete answers. Moses understood this like few others. At a decisive moment, faced with the responsibility of moving forward, he made a statement that reveals where his confidence was. If your presence is not with us, do not bring us up from here. Exodus 33:15. He could have followed with strategies, with plans, with everything he had ever seen God do. But he knew that none of this replaced presence. This shows that God's presence is not just a detail in the journey, it is the very foundation. Without it, even the right path becomes heavy. With it, even the difficult paths become bearable. Psalm 91:1 says, He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will rest under the shadow of the Almighty. To inhabit means to stay, not just visit. It is to develop a continual awareness that God is present, not just at specific times, but at all times. And this is where the mind begins to be transformed in a practical way. When you learn to turn your attention to God in the middle of the day, when you begin to talk to Him in simple thoughts, when you choose to remember His presence instead of losing yourself in worries, gradually your mind finds a new pattern. It's not something forced, it's built. Small moments of connection that, added together, create a different internal environment. And in this environment, negative thoughts do not find space as easily. Anxiety doesn't dominate as it used to. There's a constant feeling that you're not alone. God's presence becomes a real refuge, not something distant, but accessible. Not something theoretical, but lived. And when the mind learns to dwell in that place, it ceases to be a field of tension and becomes a place of rest. Maybe you're still trying to find peace in external things. waiting for something to change to finally feel better. But there is an invitation happening now, something deeper, more stable, more true, a call to live in presence, not just visit. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is something being revealed, something that can change the way you live every day. Don't leave now, because what comes next can further open your vision and bring you to a level of understanding that you may never have experienced before. There are periods in life when everything seems dry, silent, and difficult to understand. Moments when the answers don't come, emotions get confused, and the mind starts to question everything. These moments are called, in the Bible, desert. And while many see the desert as abandonment, it is actually one of the most profound places of transformation that God uses. The desert is not comfortable. It exposes, reveals, confronts. It is there that distractions disappear and the mind comes face to face with what is really inside it. And that is exactly why God allows these periods, not to destroy, but to purify. Jesus went through this. Before he began his purpose, he was led into the wilderness. And there he faced temptations that were not only external, but deeply linked to his identity. In Matthew 4:3, the provocation begins with a subtle doubt. If thou art the Son of God. Notice this. The attack wasn't just about turning stones into bread, it was about questioning who he was. And this continues to happen today. In difficult moments, the mind begins to hear similar questions. Are you capable? Is God really with you? Is all this worth it? The enemy always tries to achieve identity before touching the purpose, because if it can confuse who you are, it can weaken the path you should follow. But the desert also has another purpose. Deuteronomy 8:2 reveals, "And you shall remember all the way, to humble you and to prove you, to know what was in your heart." This shows that the wilderness reveals, not for God to discover something, but for you to realize what still needs to be aligned within you. It is in the wilderness that the mind is trained to depend less on circumstances and more on God. It is there that you learn to trust even without signs, to remain firm even without answers, to continue even when everything seems to be at a standstill. And little by little, something begins to change. The mind that once sought control begins to learn surrender. The mind that was agitated by any difficulty begins to gain resistance. The desert does not weaken those who remain. It strengthens. Maybe you're living one of those moments right now. A time when things don't make sense, when the answers seem distant. But what if this is not a time of loss, but of preparation? What if God is using exactly this scenario to align your mind and strengthen your identity? Because when you leave the desert, you don't leave the same. You come out firmer, more aware, more prepared. And above all, with a mind that does not let itself be shaken as easily. If, as you hear this, you recognize that God has been good, even in the midst of difficulties, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes recognizing this is the first step to seeing the desert in a completely different way. There is something silent but extremely powerful that can sustain or weaken your faith every day, the way you remember things. Memory is not just a record of the past. It directly influences how you see the present. And when the mind is not in line with God, it tends to remember the pains more than the deliverances, more the losses than the provisions. The people of Israel experienced this repeatedly. They saw miracles, they crossed the sea, they were sustained in the desert, but in a short time they forgot. And when they forgot, they began to doubt, to complain, to move away. It was not a lack of God, it was a lack of active spiritual memory. Hence the psalmist declares in Psalm 103:2, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not any of his benefits." This is not just an invitation to gratitude, it is an instruction to the mind. It is a call to remember intentionally, to bring to consciousness that which strengthens faith. Because when you forget what God has already done, any current problem seems bigger than it really is. But when you remember, something changes inside you. Doubt loses space, and confidence begins to grow again. David understood this secret in a practical way. In front of Goliath, he not only focused on the size of the challenge, but brought to mind what he had already lived with God. In 1 Samuel 17:37, he declares, "The Lord delivered me from the lion's claws. He will deliver me." Notice this. He used the past as a basis to face the present. This reveals a powerful spiritual strategy, training the mind to remember correctly. It is not denying the difficulties, but choosing not to forget the victories. It's looking back and recognizing how many times God has sustained you, even when it seemed impossible. And this can be developed. It starts with small attitudes, such as remembering times when everything went right, when it seemed like it would go wrong. How to recognize answers to prayer, deliverances, unexpected provisions. Gradually, your mind starts to have a new pattern. Instead of reacting with fear, it responds with faith. Because spiritual memory works as an anchor. When the present tries to shake you, it holds you. When doubt tries to grow, it reminds you of who God is and what He has already done. Maybe you're facing something right now that seems greater than your strength. But what if you stop for a moment and remember, how many times have you thought you couldn't do it and you did? How many times did it seem like the end and God opened a way? This shift in focus doesn't just change what you think, it changes what you feel. Faith begins to occupy the space where there was previously insecurity. This word is not for everyone. If you are here, it is because there is something that God wants to activate within your mind. Don't leave now. What comes next can further deepen this transformation and show you how to keep that faith alive every day, regardless of what happens around you. There is an invisible block that prevents many people from advancing spiritually. And it is not in the circumstances, nor in the external difficulties, but within the mind itself. This blockage is called arrogance. And it is not just blatant arrogance, but an inner posture that resists being molded, that insists on maintaining control, that has difficulty recognizing its own dependence on God. The proud mind believes that it already knows, that it has tried, that it has understood everything. She even listens, but filters everything based on her own conclusions. And without realizing it, he closes the door to what God wants to do. Because God does not force transformation on a mind that does not allow itself to be taught. On the other hand, there is a spiritual key that makes room for something completely new: humility. And humility is not thinking less of oneself, but recognizing that without God there is no true direction. It is to admit that there are still areas that need to be adjusted, thoughts that need to be renewed, paths that need to be realigned. Nehemiah lived this in a profound way. Faced with an enormous challenge, the reconstruction of Jerusalem, he did not begin with strategy or human planning. He began with prayer. In Nehemiah 1-6, he declares, "Let thine ears be attentive to the prayer of your servant." This reveals a mind that is totally dependent, aware that without God nothing would make sense. And it is exactly this posture that makes room for divine direction. Because when you recognize your dependency, you become sensitive. You start to listen more, to perceive more, to discern better. The mind ceases to be rigid and becomes available. James 4:6 says, "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." This means that it is not just a matter of human choice. There is a divine response involved. God approaches those who stand with humility. It releases grace, direction, understanding. And perhaps the deepest thing about all of this is to realize that humility does not weaken the mind. It strengthens it, because a humble mind learns faster, grows deeper, and adjusts more easily. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't need to sustain an image. It just needs to be available. Surrendering one's mind to God goes directly through this place. It is to let go of control. It is to stop insisting on one's own paths when one already realizes that they are not working. It is to make room for something new, even if it confronts old certainties. And in this process, something begins to happen in a silent but powerful way. The mind becomes lighter, more sensitive, more aligned, and what once seemed confusing begins to gain clarity, not because everything has changed around us, but because the way of thinking has been transformed. Humility prepares the ground where God plants direction, and when that ground is ready, the mind ceases to resist. And he begins, finally, to receive. There is a way of looking at life that completely changes the way you react to situations. It is not something natural, it does not come from the physical eyes, but from a mind aligned with God. It is spiritual vision. And when this vision opens up, what once seemed threatening begins to lose strength, because you start to realize that there is more going on than what is visible. The problem is that most people live limited to what they see. If the situation seems difficult, the mind is filled with fear. If the scenario is uncertain, thoughts become negative. Everything is interpreted based on what the eyes show. But faith and surrender of the mind to God create a new way of seeing. Eliseo lived this in a remarkable way. In a moment of danger, an enemy army surrounded the city where he was. His servant, seeing that scene, went into despair. For him, all was lost. But Elisha remained at peace. And then he prayed a simple but powerful prayer. Lord, I pray you open his eyes that he may see. 2 Kings 6:17. And when the spiritual eyes were opened, reality changed completely. The mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire around them. What changed was not the external situation, but the way of seeing it. That which was already present became visible. And this reveals something profound. Many times God is already at work, but the mind cannot yet perceive it. 2 Corinthians 4:18 says, "We do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen." This means that there is a spiritual reality greater than what the natural eye can grasp. And when the mind aligns with God, it begins to consider that reality. This completely transforms the way we deal with fear. Because fear is born from what seems bigger, stronger, more threatening. But when you see spiritually, you understand that God is present, that there is protection, that there is a purpose being fulfilled even when it is not visible. Developing this view requires spiritual practice. It requires stopping reacting automatically to what you see and starting to seek God's perspective. It is to remember the Word. It is to trust even without immediate proof. It is to believe that there is something beyond what is in front of your eyes. And little by little, the mind begins to change. What once generated despair is now faced calmly. What seemed impossible begins to be seen as an opportunity for God to act. Spiritual vision strengthens the mind because it does not depend only on what is visible. Maybe you're looking at a situation right now and all you can see are limitations. But what if there is something beyond that? What if God is already at work in a way you haven't noticed yet? Can you imagine how many people need to see it this way right now? Just as this message has come to you, it can reach others who also need direction and hope. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel and activating the bell, you become an instrument for this truth to reach even more lives. There is something that feeds your mind every day, even if you don't realize it. Just as the body needs food to survive, the mind also needs to be nourished to stay firm, balanced, and aligned. And the question that few ask is, what have you been feeding your thoughts with? Because the mind is never empty. If it is not being filled with truth, it will automatically be occupied by worries, fears, external opinions, and everything that weakens faith. And that's why so many people feel mentally tired, confused, without direction. It is not only what they face, but what they consume internally. Jesus made this clear when he said, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." Matthew 4:4. This reveals that there is an invisible but essential food, something that sustains not the body, but the soul and mind. And when this food is neglected, the interior begins to weaken. Jeremiah understood this in a profound way. He did not treat the word as something distant or superficial. In Jeremiah 15:16, he declares, "When your words were found, I immediately ate them." This shows an active attitude. He didn't just listen. He absorbed, internalized, made the word part of himself. And that's exactly what transforms the mind. It's not the occasional contact. It's not hearing once in a while. It's continuous exposure. It is allowing the word to enter, remain, and begin to replace old thoughts. Because little by little, what you consume starts to shape the way you think. If the mind is fed with fear, it responds with insecurity. If it is fed with doubt, it reacts with uncertainty. But when it is fed with the Word of God, something begins to change. Verses begin to appear in the memory at the right moments. Truths begin to confront inner lies. The mind gains strength to resist what it once dominated, and without realizing it, you start to think differently. This doesn't happen instantaneously, but it's consistent. Just as the body is not strengthened by a single meal, the mind also needs constancy. Small daily moments of contact with the Word generate an accumulative transformation. And there comes a point when what once shook you no longer has the same effect. Not because the problems have disappeared, but because your mind is strengthened. There is an inner foundation that sustains you, a truth that remains even when everything around you changes. Surrendering your mind to God is also choosing what you will feed it. It is to decide that the Word will have more space than any other influence. And when this choice becomes practical, the mind ceases to be vulnerable and becomes firm, supported by something that does not change. There is a silent force that separates those who advance from those who fall by the wayside, perseverance. It is not something visible, it does not appear in beautiful words, but it is revealed in constancy, in the decision to continue even when the mind asks to stop. And it is precisely in the most difficult moments that this force is formed. The human mind seeks quick results, immediate answers, clear signs that everything is working. But the walk with God does not always follow this rhythm. There are periods when nothing seems to change, when prayers seem to have no answer, when mental fatigue begins to weigh down. And this is where many give up. Not because they have no faith, but because they have not developed resistance. Job lived this in an extreme way. He lost everything, faced pain, silence, and misunderstanding, and yet he declared something that reveals a strengthened mind. But he knows the way I go. When he proves me, I will come out like gold. Job 23:10. Notice the depth of it. He didn't understand what was happening, but he chose to trust the process. That's perseverance. It's not to continue because it's easy. It's to continue even when it doesn't make sense. It's keeping your mind steady when everything around you tries to shake it. It is deciding not to give up faith even when there are no explanations. Hebrews 10:36 says, "For you need patience, that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise." This shows that there is a gap between obedience and the result. And that interval is where the mind is shaped. Because every time you stay, something strengthens within you. Every time you don't give up, even tired, your mind becomes more resistant. And little by little, what would once make you stop no longer has the same power. Perseverance creates stability. It prevents you from being carried away by the emotions of the moment. A difficult day no longer defines his decisions. A negative thought no longer changes your path. There is an inner firmness that begins to take hold, and this does not happen all at once. It's built day after day, choice after choice. It's waking up and continuing, even without feeling like it. It is trusting, even without seeing. It is to stay, even when everything suggests otherwise. Maybe you're exactly at that point right now, tired, without clear answers, feeling that he is doing his part, but without seeing results. But what if this moment is not a sign to stop, but an opportunity to strengthen yourself? Because when you go through this process, something changes forever. The mind ceases to be fragile and becomes firm. And a steady mind is not easily shaken. If this message found you at the right time, keep it in your heart and turn it into a simple statement now. Write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Sometimes, remembering this is what sustains you to keep going another day. There is a level of transformation that happens when you stop praying only for yourself and start interceding for others. Because intercession doesn't just change what's around us, it profoundly changes what is inside you. The mind that intercedes is no longer limited by its own concerns and starts to see beyond, aligning itself with the heart of God. Often, the mind closes itself off in personal problems, repeating thoughts, revolving around the same concerns. But when you start interceding, something expands. You step off center and allow God to broaden your vision. And without realizing it, what once seemed so heavy begins to lose strength. Daniel lived this constantly. Even in the face of real threats, he did not negotiate his prayer life. Daniel 6:10 says, 3 times in the day he knelt down and prayed. This wasn't an empty habit. It was an ongoing connection that kept your mind aligned with God, regardless of the circumstances. And that's what intercession does. It repositions the mind. Instead of reacting to what is happening, you begin to act spiritually. Instead of holding on to what you see, you start looking for what God wants to do. Ezekiel 22:30 reveals something striking. I sought among them a man to stop the wall, but I found no one. This shows that God is looking for people who are willing to put themselves in that place. People who understand that praying is not just asking, but taking a spiritual stand. When you intercede, your mind begins to align with God's thoughts. You start to notice details that you previously ignored. Your spiritual sensitivity increases, and what once seemed distant begins to become clearer. Intercession also strengthens your connection with God, because it is not a quick, superficial prayer. It is a time of surrender, of listening, of alignment. And in this process, your mind is being molded. Selfish thoughts begin to lose space. Anxiety decreases. Faith grows. Because you begin to see beyond yourself, beyond the circumstances, beyond the present moment. And it completely transforms the way you live. Your mind ceases to be a place of constant worry and becomes an active channel of God's will. You begin to participate in what God is doing, not just as a spectator, but as someone spiritually involved. Perhaps you have never seen prayer in this way. Perhaps you have always prayed only in times of need. But there is an invitation happening here, a call to a deeper level, where your mind not only seeks answers, but becomes part of God's action. What you will hear next can open up this dimension within you even more, something that few realize, but that can completely change your way of thinking and relating to God. Stay until the end, because there is a revelation waiting for you that can transform your mind from the inside out. There are specific moments in life when something changes within you suddenly, as if an alert was activated in your mind. It's not fear, it's not emotional pressure. It is a sense of urgency that cannot be ignored. It's as if, on the inside, you know that the time has come to act, to decide, to take a stand. And this urgency does not come by chance. It is born when God begins to awaken the mind to a specific time, The problem is that many times when this call comes, the first reaction of the mind is to resist, not because he doesn't understand, but because he knows that obeying will require change. And that's exactly what happened to Jonas. When God said, "Arise, go to the great city of Nineveh and cry out against it." Jonah 1:2, there was no doubt in the direction. It was clear, direct, urgent, but even so, Jonas tried to escape. This reveals something profound. The mind can recognize the call and still resist it. He may understand what needs to be done, but look for alternative ways to avoid the discomfort of obedience. And in this process, spiritual time keeps moving forward, while the mind tries to postpone. But God's urgency does not disappear. It remains, insists, returns. Because it's not anxiety, it's not despair. It is clarity. It is knowing that that moment carries something that cannot be ignored. And when Jonah finally surrendered, when he stopped running away and decided to obey, something extraordinary happened. Not only did his life line up, but an entire city was impacted. This shows that when you respond to God's timing, the effect goes far beyond you. There is a greater reach, a purpose that connects with other lives, other stories. Romans 13:11 says, "And this I say, knowing the time, that it is high time that we awake from sleep." This means that there are times when continuing as you are is no longer an option. The mind needs to wake up, perceive, position itself. And maybe you're right at that point right now, feeling that something needs to change, that you can no longer postpone certain decisions, that there is a call that you have been ignoring or leaving for later. This feeling is not by chance. Discerning this time requires sensitivity. It is not acting on impulse, but recognizing when God is accelerating something inside you. And responding to this takes courage, because it often means getting out of comfort, breaking with old patterns, taking steps that you have avoided for too long. But it is at this moment that the mind really aligns, when he stops resisting and begins to obey, when it stops running away and starts walking in the right direction. Because the urgency of God does not come to confuse, it comes to awaken. There is something powerful that happens when God transforms someone's mind. This transformation is not hidden. It becomes visible. It's not just a silent inner change. It's living evidence that impacts everyone around. Because when the mind is restored, life begins to reflect that change clearly. The Gadarene demoniac is one of the most striking examples of this. Before he met Jesus, he lived completely dominated, out of control, trapped in a reality of destruction. His mind was disordered, his life out of direction. But in a single encounter with Jesus, everything changed. Mark 5:15 describes the scene strikingly. "And they came to Jesus and saw the demoniac man, clothed and in a sound mind." What was once chaos has become balance. What was out of control became domination. And the strongest thing about all this is that he didn't have to say anything at first. His transformation already spoke for itself. This shows that a restored mind becomes a living witness. People notice, feel the difference. Testimony goes beyond words. He is proof that something real has happened inside you. That's when your way of thinking changes, your reaction changes, your posture changes. And those who knew you before begin to realize that there is something different. Revelation 12:11 says, "And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of his testimony." This reveals that testimony has spiritual power, not just to tell a story, but to win, to liberate, to impact other lives. Because when one sees a transformed mind, one begins to believe that it is also possible. When someone realizes that you no longer react as before, that you have peace where there was confusion before, that you keep faith where there was doubt before, this generates something in others. And that's how God uses lives. Not just through words, but through evidence. Your renewed mind becomes an instrument. Your transformation becomes a path for others. Maybe you're still in the process, you're still dealing with inner changes, you're still learning to surrender your mind completely to God, but every step counts. Each change is already visible in some way. And as you move forward, something starts happening around you. People begin to approach, to observe, to ask. Because a mind aligned with God does not go unnoticed. And perhaps, while you hear this, there is something inside you that desires this transformation, not only for yourself, but also for someone close to you, someone who needs deliverance, someone who needs a touch from God. If this is your case, write your prayer request in the comments. Put before God what is in your heart, whether for you or for someone else. When we come together in faith, something powerful happens. And that connection can open up paths that you can't yet see. There is a silent test that happens in the mind when a promise is slow to fulfill. In the beginning, the Word of God generates hope, ignites something within you, brings expectation. But as time goes by, when nothing seems to change, the mind begins to question. Will it really happen? Did I understand correctly? And it is in this interval between promise and fulfillment that many get lost, because the human mind has been conditioned to believe only what it sees. When something takes time, she tries to fill the silence with doubts. And little by little, what began with faith can be weakened by waiting, but it is exactly at this point that true trust is built. Sarah lived this in a profound way. When he was promised that he would have a child, everything around him said otherwise. Time had passed. The natural conditions were not favorable, and at one point she even doubted. But even so, the promise did not fail. Hebrews 11:11 says, "By faith Sarah herself also received power to conceive." This shows that the fulfillment depended not on circumstances, but on God's faithfulness. And here's a key that transforms the mind. God doesn't work with human limitations. It does not depend on time as we do. It does not fit the conditions. He fulfills what he promises because his nature is faithful. Numbers 23:19 declares, "God is not a man that he should lie." This means that when God speaks, it is already established. Even if it is not yet visible, there is already a spiritual reality being built. The challenge is to sustain the mind in this place. Do not allow the apparent delay to turn into doubt. Do not let time erase what God has already said, because tardiness does not mean absence. It often means preparation. While you wait, something is being adjusted. Your mind is being strengthened. Your faith is being deepened. Your confidence is being refined. And when the right moment comes, you realize that it was not just about receiving, but about becoming someone capable of sustaining what was promised. Maybe you're expecting something right now, an answer, a change, a sign, and the mind begins to tire of this waiting. But there is something that needs to be kept inside you. If it was God who promised, there is no possibility of failure. Surrendering the mind to God is also this. It is trusting even when you do not see it. It is standing firm even when everything seems to be at a standstill. It is deciding that the promise has more weight than any circumstance. And little by little, this confidence begins to calm the mind. Anxiety decreases, doubt loses strength, and a silent certainty begins to grow. Not because you saw it happen, but because you know who you trusted. There are times when the mind seems to be enveloped in a darkness that is difficult to explain. It's not just sadness, it's not just tiredness. It's a feeling of discouragement that weighs you down, that takes away motivation, that makes everything seem meaningless. And the most challenging thing is that in these moments, even faith can seem distant, but there is something that God does in just such scenarios. He plants hope where it would not exist, not as a passing emotion, but as a spiritual decision that begins within the mind. Jeremiah experienced this in one of the most difficult moments in history. Jerusalem was destroyed. The scene was one of pain, loss, and utter desolation. Humanly speaking, there was no reason to believe in better days. Still, in the midst of this scenario, he declares something surprising. I want to bring to mind what can give me hope. Lamentations 3:21-23. Notice this carefully. He didn't wait to feel hope before reacting. He decided to remember. He chose to direct his mind to that which could still sustain his faith. This shows that hope is not born from circumstances. It is born from choosing where you place your thoughts. Because when the mind is fixed only on the problem, darkness grows. But when you start to bring to mind what God has already done, what he has promised, what he is, something begins to change. Romans 15:13 says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace." That means hope doesn't come from you, it comes from God. But to receive it, the mind needs to be open, it needs to be willing to reposition itself. Maybe you're living in such a moment right now, a time when things are not clear, when the mood has waned, when the mind seems tired of trying. But there's a key here. You can choose to nurture hope even before you see any change, and it starts simply. It is remembering that God remains in control even when everything seems out of place. It is to recognize that history is not yet over. It is to believe that there is something being prepared even if you don't see it now. Hope is rekindled when the mind refuses to accept darkness as the final answer. When you decide that regardless of what's going on, God still has a purpose, he still has a plan, he's still at work, and little by little something begins to change inside. Not necessarily around, but inside. The mind begins to rise again, the strength returns, even if slowly. Faith begins to rekindle, even if it is still small. And perhaps right now, that word is reaching you right where you needed it most. As a reminder that there is still hope, that there is still a way, that there is still a God who takes care of everything. If this touched your soul in any way, write in the comments, "God chose me." Because sometimes remembering this is the first step to getting out of the darkness and starting to see the light again. There is a level of spiritual sensitivity where the mind begins to realize that God is not only in the big moments, but also in the simplest details of life. And this completely changes the way of living. Because when you understand that God guides every step, even what seems small becomes meaningful. Many people expect direction only for big decisions, decisive moments, complex situations. But they ignore the small signs, the subtle adjustments, the doors that open or close without explanation. And it is exactly in these details that God often reveals himself. Rebekah's story shows this clearly. When Abraham's servant was sent to find a wife for Isaac, he didn't have a map, he didn't have guarantees, he didn't have control of the situation, so he did something that reveals a mind that is totally dependent on God. In Genesis 24:14, he prays, "Let it be that the maiden be the one you have appointed." He even placed before God the details of the meeting. And the most impressive thing is that the answer came exactly as he had requested. It wasn't something random, it was precise direction. Every detail fell into place, every movement led to purpose. This shows that God doesn't just respond, he directs with exactitude when the mind is open to perceiving. Proverbs 3:6 states, "In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." This means that there is no area of life where God does not want to participate. The problem is not the absence of direction. It is the lack of sensitivity to recognize. When the mind is surrendered, it begins to perceive what previously went unnoticed. A path that opens up effortlessly. A decision that brings peace even without explanation. A discomfort that prevents you from going down a wrong path. These are all forms of direction, and little by little you start to trust these signs more, not impulsively, but with discernment. The mind stops acting only by human logic and starts to consider God's guidance at every step. This brings a different security. It is not the certainty that everything will be easy, but the confidence that you are being guided. And when there is direction, even mistakes become learning. Even deviations become adjustments. Maybe you're waiting for a clear answer to something important, something that has occupied his mind, generated doubts, brought uncertainty. But what if the answer is already being built on the details you haven't noticed yet? Because God is not limited to what is visible. He works behind the scenes, aligning situations, connecting paths, preparing meetings, opening doors at the right time. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and this moment is not by chance. There is something being aligned, something being prepared, something that can change its direction. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can bring the clarity you have been seeking. There are pains that words cannot explain. These are feelings that accumulate in silence, thoughts that weigh down, memories that insist on coming back. And many times the mind tries to move on, but inside something is still wounded. The hardest thing is when no one notices. When everything seems normal on the outside, but inside there is a deep emotional fatigue. But there is one truth that needs to reach you now. God does not ignore this pain. He does not move away when the mind is downcast. He draws near. And not with judgment, not with demand, but with consolation. Anna lived a moment like this. Her pain was deep, silent, charged with anguish. And instead of hiding, she did something that many avoid doing. She opened herself completely before God. In 1 Samuel 1:10 it is written, "She prayed to the Lord with bitterness of soul." She didn't try to disguise it. She didn't try to be strong at that moment. She simply poured out her soul. And it is exactly in this place of delivery that something begins to change. Because when you stop keeping everything inside you and allow God to touch those areas, healing begins. It's not instantaneous, it's not superficial, it is profound. 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 declares, "The God of all comfort, comfort us in all our tribulation." This means that there is no pain that God cannot achieve. There is no wound that he cannot heal. And more than that, he transforms what hurt into something that empowers. God's consolation does not erase history, but it changes the weight it carries. What once brought sadness begins to lose strength. What seemed unbearable begins to become light. And the mind, which was once tired, begins to find rest. Surrendering your mind to God is also this, allowing him to enter the areas you have avoided for so long. It is recognizing that you don't have to carry everything alone. It is trusting that even in the most sensitive parts, he knows exactly how to restore. And little by little, something begins to happen. The pain does not disappear overnight, but it no longer dominates as it used to. Sadness no longer controls your thoughts. There is a presence, a care, a peace that begins to occupy this space. Maybe you've gotten used to living with certain pains, believing that they're part of who you are. But God doesn't see it that way. He sees beyond the wound. He sees the restoration. And maybe this message has come to you exactly because of that, because there is something inside you that needs to be touched, cared for, restored. If that word spoke to you, don't ignore it. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue on that path, because God still has a lot to do in your mind, and every word can be part of that transformation. There is a silent battle that takes place within the mind when God calls someone. It's not just about doing something new, it's about accepting being someone different, because God's call doesn't just point away, it redefines identity. And it is exactly at this point that many get stuck, not for lack of ability, but because they cannot see themselves as God does. Gideon lived this conflict intensely. When the angel of the Lord appeared, he was not in a position of strength, nor of prominence. On the contrary, he was in hiding, trying to survive in the midst of fear and insecurity. His vision of himself was limited, marked by everything he believed he was not. But then came a statement that completely broke with that reality. "The Lord is with thee, mighty man of valor." Judges 6:12. Understand this in depth. God did not speak based on what Gideon was demonstrating at that moment, but based on what he already saw. While Gideon saw himself as weak, God called him valiant. While he saw himself incapable, God already saw a deliverer. And this is one of the greatest challenges of the mind, accepting the identity that God declares, even when it seems distant from the current reality. Because the mind tends to cling to the past, to experiences, to failures, to limitations. It builds an image based on what has already happened. But God works from purpose, not history. 1 Peter 2:9 says, "But you are the chosen generation." This reveals that there is a spiritual identity defined by God, regardless of the circumstances. It's not something you get first and then receive. It is something that you receive, and from that you begin to live. The process of surrendering the mind goes through exactly this place. It is allowing God to replace the old way of thinking about himself with a new truth. It is to look beyond the flaws, beyond the fears, beyond the insecurities, and begin to see what God has declared. This does not happen automatically. Often the mind resists. He questions, doubts, tries to return to the old pattern. But each time you choose to believe what God says, something begins to line up within you. And little by little, this new identity is no longer just an idea and becomes a reality. Your attitudes change, your posture changes, your decisions begin to reflect what you have come to believe. Not because you have become perfect, but because your mind has been repositioned. You stop living as someone limited by the past and start living as someone called by God. And maybe right now God is doing just that with you, calling you to a new level, revealing an identity you didn't see yet. Not based on what you feel, but on what he has already decided. Because when God calls, he doesn't just point to a destination. It transforms who you are on the way. There is a silent trap that affects many people's minds. Isolation. At first glance, it may seem like just a desire to be alone, to avoid conversations, to step away for a while. But over time, this begins to weaken the mind in a profound way. Because the mind was not created to walk alone. When you isolate yourself, your thoughts cease to be confronted. What you believe, feel, or fear begins to grow out of balance. Small worries become big ones, doubts intensify, and the view of reality begins to distort. It is as if the mind has lost reference, but God never intended it to be this way. From the beginning, he established fellowship as an essential part of the spiritual life. The early church understood this in a powerful way. Acts 2:46 says, "And with one accord persevering always." This shows that it was not something occasional, it was constant. They walked together, shared, strengthened each other, and this generated something profound, mental and spiritual stability. Because when you are in communion, you don't carry everything alone. There is exchange, there is support, there is encouragement. What could knock you down on your own becomes lighter when shared. Hebrews 10:25 reinforces this. Not leaving our congregation. This is not just advice, it is a protection. Because communion guards the mind against distorted thoughts, against silent discouragement, against the feeling of being alone in everything. And perhaps most importantly, when you're in an environment of faith, your mind is constantly reminded of the truth. Even when you are weak, someone else is steady. Even when your faith wavers, someone is there to lift you up. This creates a balance. Communion also reveals something that you alone cannot see. Sometimes you are stuck with a limited vision, a repetitive thought, an interpretation that does not correspond to reality, and in a moment of conversation, sharing, prayer together, something opens. The mind adjusts. Surrendering one's mind to God also involves this: accepting to walk with others, to allow yourself to be helped, advised, strengthened, not as a sign of weakness but as part of God's plan. And little by little the mind begins to strengthen, not just by your own faith but by the collective faith. There is a force that is born of unity, something that sustains, that encourages, that protects. Maybe you've drifted away, maybe you've closed yourself off, maybe you've learned to handle everything on your own. But there is an invitation being made now, a call to get out of this place and connect again. Not many people will understand this depth, but if you are here, there is something being awakened within you. Keep going, because what is yet to be revealed can further strengthen your mind and transform the way you live your faith every day. There is a detail in walking with God that many ignore, but that makes all the difference. He doesn't just direct, He confirms. God is not a God of confusion. Along the way, He leaves signs, small confirmations that align the mind and strengthen the certainty that you are in the right direction. The problem is that these signs are not always obvious. They do not appear clearly to those who are distracted or with their minds taken by anxiety. It takes spiritual sensitivity to perceive, because God often speaks in subtle ways, in details that only an attentive mind can recognize. The magicians lived this in a remarkable way. They didn't have a detailed map, they didn't have all the answers, but they did have one sign, a star, and it was enough. Matthew 2:10 says, "And when they saw the star, they rejoiced greatly." That star wasn't just something in the sky. It was a confirmation that they were on the right path, and realize they did not run in a disorderly manner, nor were they paralyzed waiting for more signals. They followed on based on what God had already shown. This reveals an important balance. Signs are not meant to replace faith, but to confirm it. Isaiah 30:21 declares, "This is the way, walk ye in it." This shows that God communicates, guides, points out directions. But it is necessary to discern, because not everything that seems like a sign comes from God. And an unprepared mind can easily get confused. Therefore, surrendering the mind to God is essential in this process. When the mind is aligned, it does not move on impulse or out of desperation. He learns to observe, to wait, to confirm. He does not rush, but neither does he ignore what God is showing. God's signs bring peace, not confusion. They align. They don't destabilize. Even if the path is not yet entirely clear, there is an internal security that accompanies these signs. Something inside you recognizes. And this develops over time. The more you walk with God, the more you learn to identify the way He speaks. Small details start to make sense. Connections that previously went unnoticed begin to reveal themselves. Perhaps you are looking for clear answers, expecting something big, visible, unquestionable. But what if God is already guiding you through small signs? What if the answer you've been waiting for has already begun, but hasn't yet been realized? The surrendered mind learns to trust this process. He learns to value what God has already shown instead of being stuck with what has not yet been revealed. And little by little, the path is being drawn. Because God doesn't leave you lost. He guides, confirms, and accompanies every step. And when the mind is aligned with Him, even the most discreet signs become powerful directions. There is a spiritual truth that completely changes the way you view life's battles. No victory begins on the outside. Before any visible achievement, before any concrete change, something needs to happen inside the mind, because that's where the first battle is fought, and it is there that it needs to be overcome. Many people wait to see external changes so that they can feel confident, safe, at peace. But God's way is the opposite. It starts from the inside out. It transforms the way of thinking, strengthens the mind, aligns thoughts. And then, as a consequence, victory begins to manifest itself. Joshua was given a huge mission to conquer a land, to lead a people, to face challenges that required courage. But before any strategy, before any movement, God gave a clear, direct, and profound instruction. Let not the book of this law depart from your mouth. Joshua 1:8. That is, before conquering territories, he needed to align his mind. This reveals that true preparation is not just in what you do, but in what you think. Because a misaligned mind can turn opportunities into fear. It can make you retreat even when you're facing victory. But a mind aligned with God sees differently. It remains steadfast, even when the scenario has not yet changed. And that's why so many battles are lost before they even start. Not because of lack of capacity, but because the mind has already been dominated by doubt, fear, insecurity. And when that happens, the person doesn't even try, or gives up halfway. But when the mind is strengthened, something changes completely. There is a trust that does not depend on circumstances. There is a firmness that is not easily shaken. And this creates an internal environment where victory begins to form. 1 Corinthians 15:57 states, "But thanks be to God, who gives us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." This means that victory is not just the result of human effort, but of a spiritual alignment. This is when your mind connects with God's truth and starts living from it. Surrendering one's mind to God is therefore the first step to any real achievement. It is deciding that your thoughts will no longer be guided by fear, but by faith, that their decisions will no longer be based on insecurity, but on trust. And little by little, what once seemed impossible begins to become accessible. Not because the problem has disappeared, but because you have changed inside. Your way of thinking has changed, and that changes everything. Maybe you're still looking at situations that seem difficult, battles that seem too big. But the question now is not about what is before you. It's about what's inside of you. If this message has brought clarity to your heart, write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Because sometimes declaring this is the first step to overcoming what is still being held in your mind. There is a clear difference between a mind guided by impulses and a mind governed by spiritual discipline. The first reacts, lets itself be carried away by the moment, changes according to emotions. The second remains firm, even when everything around tries to destabilize. And this difference defines the course of life, because the impulses are immediate, intense, but fleeting. They are born of emotions, pressures, circumstances. Discipline, on the other hand, is built. It requires decision, constancy, commitment, and at first it may seem difficult. But over time, it becomes the foundation that sustains the mind. Daniel understood this in a profound way. In an environment completely contrary to God's principles, surrounded by influences that could easily lead him astray, he made a quiet but powerful decision. Daniel 1:8 says, "Daniel sat in his heart not to defile himself." This happened before any external pressure. It was an internal choice. And this is exactly how spiritual discipline begins. Not in visible actions, but in internal decisions that no one sees. It's when you decide what you're going to allow into your mind, what's going to feed your thoughts, what's going to guide your choices. Many think that discipline limits, that it takes away freedom, that it prevents them from living fully. But the truth is the opposite. Discipline frees the mind from chaos. It prevents you from being controlled by any momentary emotion. It creates a filter that protects your thoughts. 1 Corinthians 9:27 reinforces this, "But I subdue my body and bring it into bondage." This is not about repression, it's about domination. It is taking control of one's own mind rather than being controlled by it. Because when there is no discipline, the mind becomes vulnerable. Any thought enters, any feeling dominates, any situation destabilizes. But when there is discipline, there is a pattern, there is a direction, there is an alignment with God's will. And this is built on a daily basis, in small decisions, in moments when you choose not to give in to what is easiest, but to follow what is right. In situations where you decide to keep your mind steady, even when it would be simpler to give up. Over time, this strengthens you. The mind becomes more stable, clearer, more resilient. What once dominated you loses strength. What once confused you begins to organize. Surrendering one's mind to God is also accepting this process. It is to understand that it is not just about feeling, but about deciding. It's not just about spiritual moments, but about a life built with consistency. And little by little, something changes definitively. The mind ceases to be a place of instability and becomes a place of government, no longer dominated by impulses, but driven by principles. No longer reacting to the world, but responding to God. And it is in this place that true freedom begins to be lived. There is a spiritual key capable of completely transforming the way you see life, even when nothing around you changes. That key is gratitude. And the most impressive thing is that it does not depend on circumstances. It is born from a decision of the mind, because naturally the mind tends to focus on what is missing, on what has not worked, on what has not yet happened. She gets caught up in the problem, magnifies the difficulty, and without realizing it, enters a cycle of negativity. And the more you feed this pattern, the harder it becomes to get out of it. But gratitude breaks this cycle. It repositions the mind. She changes the focus. It makes you see what previously went unnoticed. And little by little, reality begins to be interpreted differently. Jesus showed this in a simple but profound way in the story of the 10 lepers. Everyone was healed. Everyone received the miracle, but only one returned. Luke 17:15-16 says, "And one of them returned, glorifying God with a loud voice." This reveals something important. Everyone received it, but not everyone recognized it. The difference was not in the miracle, it was in the mind. One had the sensitivity to perceive, to value, to thank. And this attitude made him stand out, because gratitude is not just a reaction, it is a spiritual perception. The grateful mind begins to see God in the details, in simple things, in silent deliverances, in small answers that often go unnoticed. And the more you recognize, the more your mind opens up to perceive even more. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 says, "In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God." This doesn't mean giving thanks only when everything is okay, but developing a mindset that recognizes God in any situation, and that changes everything. Because even in the midst of difficulties, the mind finds reasons to stand firm. He does not ignore the problem, but he does not stick only to it. There is a balance, a broader vision. Gratitude also protects the mind. It prevents negative thoughts from dominating. It breaks murmurings, reduces anxiety, strengthens faith. Because when you remember what God has already done, your confidence in what He will yet do grows. And this is built with practice. It starts when you intentionally decide to say thank you. Even on difficult days, even when there are no apparent great reasons. Gradually, this creates a new standard. The mind ceases to be dominated by scarcity and starts to live in spiritual abundance. Not because everything has changed around us, but because the way of seeing has changed inside. And when that happens, something aligns. Peace increases, lightness returns, faith is strengthened, because gratitude doesn't just recognize what God has done, it prepares the mind for what He is yet to do. There is a profound difference between knowing about God and walking with God. Many accumulate information, listen to messages, repeat words, but few develop intimacy, and it is exactly in this place that the mind is truly transformed. Because intimacy is not superficial, it doesn't happen in quick or occasional moments. It is built on constancy, proximity, and relationship. And the closer the mind is to God, the more it begins to naturally align with Him. Enoch lived this in a way that defies any ordinary explanation. The Bible does not highlight great achievements, does not mention visible achievements, but it reveals something much deeper. And Enoch walked with God, and he didn't show up again. Genesis 5:24. This shows a life of communion so intense that his mind was completely connected with the divine. And that's what intimacy does. It doesn't just change external behaviors, it transforms the interior. Thoughts begin to align, desires begin to change, the way of seeing life adjusts, not by forced effort, but because closeness to God begins to influence everything. Psalm 25:14 declares, "The secret of the Lord is to those who fear Him." This means that there are levels of revelation that are not accessed just by listening, but by approaching. God shares with those who are close. It reveals paths, brings understanding, directs thoughts, and this generates spiritual sensitivity. The mind begins to perceive more clearly that which comes from God. Small signs become more evident, decisions become safer, peace starts to guide choices. But this intimacy needs to be cultivated. It doesn't happen by chance. It is built in simple but consistent moments, in the time set apart with God, in the attention given to His presence, in the willingness to listen more than to speak. And little by little, something begins to change continuously. The mind is no longer influenced only by the external environment and is shaped by this internal connection. What used to confuse loses strength. What he once dominated begins to dissipate. Surrendering the mind to God finds here one of the deepest levels. Because it's not just about controlling thoughts, it's about living so close that your thoughts begin to reflect His. And when this happens, the transformation ceases to be momentary and becomes constant. It no longer depends on specific situations, but on a living relationship that sustains the mind every day. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed. A level of understanding that can open your eyes to something you may never have noticed before. And that may be just what was missing to complete this transformation within you. There is something inside the mind that can completely paralyze a person, even when all external conditions seem favorable. That something is fear. He doesn't need concrete evidence. He doesn't need a real threat to act. All it takes is a thought, a possibility, a doubt, and suddenly the mind is filled with insecurity. But there is one truth that changes everything. The same place where fear is born is the place where courage can be built. The mind that learns to trust God does not automatically eliminate fear, but learns not to be dominated by it. Esther lived exactly that moment. She was facing a decision that could cost her own life. Humanly, everything pointed to silence, to preservation, to avoid risk, but something inside her spoke louder. And his statement reveals the level of decision he made. "And if I perish, I perish." Esther 4:16. This does not mean the absence of fear. It means that she chose to trust God above fear. She didn't wait until she felt completely safe to act. She decided to act even though she felt the weight of the situation. And this is exactly what defines spiritual courage. It is not a lack of fear, but a conscious choice not to allow him to control his decisions. This is when the mind recognizes the fear, but decides not to submit to it. Joshua received a direct instruction from God that reinforces this principle. "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and be of good cheer." Joshua 1:9. This shows that courage is not something that simply appears. It needs to be activated. There is an effort, a decision, a posture, and this posture begins in the mind. That's where you decide whether to retreat or advance. That's where you choose which voice you will hear, because fear will always present reasons to stop, to give up, to avoid. But faith points forward, even when the path is not completely clear. Training the mind to choose courage is a process. It starts with small decisions, at times when you could back off but decide to take a step, in situations where insecurity appears, but you choose to trust. And little by little, something begins to change. What once seemed impossible is beginning to be faced. Fear does not disappear completely, but loses control. The mind is strengthened, becomes firmer, more decisive. Surrendering your mind to God also involves this, allowing Him to strengthen you from within, so that your decisions are not guided by fear, but by trust. And maybe there's something in your life right now that calls for that courage. A decision that you have been postponing, a step that you know you need to take, but that fear has prevented. But what if that moment is exactly the turning point? Because when the mind chooses courage, something breaks, and what once seemed like a limit becomes just the beginning of something new. There is a dimension of spiritual life that many ignore, but which profoundly defines the quality of your connection with God, what you allow to remain in your mind. Because before any attitude, before any word, everything begins in thought. And that's exactly why God cares so much about what dwells inside you. The mind is like a land. Everything that is planted there sooner or later begins to produce. Constant thoughts shape emotions, which shape decisions, which shape paths. And when this terrain is not protected, it becomes vulnerable to all kinds of influences. Job understood this on a profound level. He didn't wait for the mistake to happen to act. He decided to protect his mind first. In Job 31:1, he declares, "I have made a covenant with my eyes." This reveals vigilance. He knew that what entered through the eyes could be transformed into thought, and thought could become action. This awareness changes everything, because it shows that purity does not begin in behavior, it begins in the mind. It is there that choices are made in silence before any external manifestation. Philippians 4:8 brings a clear direction. Whatever is true, think on this. This is not just advice, it is a filter. It is an orientation to select what you allow to remain in your thoughts. Because not everything that reaches your mind needs to stay. And here's an important point. Protecting the mind is not about avoiding the world, but about knowing how to filter what you absorb. It is to recognize that there are influences that strengthen and others that weaken. It is consciously deciding what you are going to feed. We live in an environment where the mind is constantly bombarded by information, images, opinions. And without realizing it, it accumulates small negative thoughts, comparisons, insecurities. All of this is taking up space. But when you start applying this principle, something changes. You start to observe more, to select more, to reject that which does not edify. And little by little, the mind begins to become lighter, clearer, more aligned. Purity of thought is not perfection, it is direction. It's an ongoing process of adjustment, where you learn to bring your mind back whenever you notice it straying. And this strengthens your spiritual life, because a clear mind becomes more sensitive to God's presence. Thoughts are organized, peace increases, clarity grows. Surrendering your mind to God is also this, allowing Him to govern not only your actions, but your innermost thoughts. It's trusting that by protecting your mind, you're protecting everything else. And when that vigilance becomes part of your life, something starts to settle in. The mind ceases to be a vulnerable place and becomes a space of communion where God can act with freedom. There is a deeper level in surrendering the mind to God that goes beyond listening, obeying, or even trusting. It is the level of total dependence. And this is one of the most challenging points, because the human mind has been trained to seek autonomy, control, independence. She wants to understand everything, solve everything, anticipate everything. But on the path with God, the more you try to control, the further you get away from the true source of direction. Dependence on God is not weakness. It is alignment. It is recognizing that, no matter how much capacity you have, there is a greater wisdom that needs to guide your steps. And when this awareness is established, something profoundly changes in the way of thinking. Jesus showed this clearly. Even though he was a son, even though he had authority, he did not act independently. In John 5:19, he declares, "The Son of himself can do nothing." This reveals a mind that is completely surrendered, totally connected to the Father. Every decision, every action, every word came from this dependence. This directly confronts the way many live today, because it is common to try to solve everything alone, to make decisions based only on one's own logic, to carry responsibilities without seeking direction. And this generates weariness, confusion, anxiety. But when the mind recognizes its dependence, it finds rest, because it no longer carries the weight of having all the answers. He starts to trust that God is guiding, even when he doesn't fully understand. Proverbs 16:3 says, "Entrust your works to the Lord." This means delivering not only the result, but the process. It is involving God in every detail, not just in times of difficulty. It is to bring to him simple decisions, daily thoughts, paths that seem small, and this transforms the routine. The mind begins to consult God before acting. He begins to perceive clearer directions, to avoid unnecessary mistakes, to walk more safely. Not because everything becomes easy, but because there is a constant connection. This dependence also strengthens faith, because each time you trust and see God act, your mind becomes steadier. Doubt loses space, confidence grows, and what once seemed uncertain begins to become secure. And little by little, living like this stops being an effort and becomes natural. You no longer need to remember all the time, because dependence becomes part of who you are. The mind remains connected, sensitive, aligned. Maybe you've learned to be strong on your own, to take matters into your own hands, not to depend on anyone. But there is a deeper invitation here, a call to live connected with the source of all wisdom. At the end of this path, something special is being prepared, an experience that can make you feel this presence in a real and deep way. Stay until the end, because what is to come can mark a new beginning in your life. There is a force that does not depend on circumstances, is not supported by results, and is not shaken by what is happening around it. This strength is born from something spiritual, deep, often misunderstood, the joy that comes from God. And unlike what many think, this joy is not the absence of problems. It is the presence of God within the mind, because natural joy fluctuates. It comes when something goes right. It disappears when something gets out of control. But spiritual joy remains. It sustains, strengthens, keeps the mind steady, even when everything seems difficult. Nehemiah revealed this at a critical moment. The people were rebuilding, facing challenges, dealing with fatigue, pressure, and difficulties. And yet, he declared something that completely changes perspective. The joy of the Lord is your strength. Nehemiah 8:10. This shows that strength came not from circumstances, but from connection with God. And this truth is repeated even more intensely in the lives of Paul and Silas. Trapped, injured, in a scenario that would naturally lead to despair, they did something unexpected. Acts 16:25 says, "And near midnight Paul and Silas prayed and sang." They chose spiritual joy in the midst of pain. This reveals a level of mastery of the mind, because singing at that moment was not an emotion, it was a decision. It was choosing to align with God above the situation, and when they did, something changed, not just within them, but around them. Spiritual joy has that power. It not only sustains the mind, it transforms the environment. Because when you decide to stay connected with God, even in difficult times, your mind doesn't sink into discouragement. She remains firm, confident, alive. And this can be developed. It is not something reserved for the few. It is something that is born when you choose to look to God above the circumstances, when you decide not to allow the moment to define your peace. Spiritual joy begins when you recognize that God is still in control, that even without understanding everything there is a purpose, that even in the midst of difficulty He remains present. And little by little, this joy becomes a foundation. The mind stops oscillating so much. Emotions stabilize. There is a constant force that sustains you inside. Maybe you're facing a tough time right now, a time when joy seems distant, when thoughts are heavy. But there is an invitation being made here, a call to access this joy that does not depend on what is happening. Because when you find that source, everything changes. The mind is strengthened, the heart is calmed, and the journey becomes lighter, even in the midst of challenges. If that word came to you at the right time, recognize it. Comment, "I believe, Lord." Sometimes a simple statement is the beginning of a new force being released within you. Everything that has been awakened so far points to a single direction. It is not enough to understand, it is necessary to surrender. The joy that strengthens the mind, the faith that sustains, the peace that guards, all this finds its deepest place when it is brought into the presence of God. Because there comes a time when thinking is no longer enough, and the soul needs to take a stand. The Word invites us to this place clearly. Hebrews 4:16 states, "Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." This means that there is an open access, a direct invitation for you to approach without fear, without barriers, exactly as you are. Now is the time to silence what is around you and allow all that has been absorbed to descend into the heart. It's not about perfect words, but about true surrender. Allow your mind to slow down, your thoughts to be still, and your attention to turn completely to God. Let us now pray together, putting before Him every thought, every concern, and every area of your life, trusting that He is in control of everything. Beloved Father, your presence is the place where the mind finds rest and the heart finds direction, and it is with that confidence that I now stand before you. Lord, I thank you for every word that has been sown so far, for every truth revealed, for every moment in which you spoke directly to my interior. Thank you that even when my mind was confused, the Lord remained faithful, bringing light where there was darkness and peace where there was restlessness. Today I ask you, Lord, to strengthen my mind to live all that I have learned. Give me wisdom to discern your voice in the midst of so many other voices, courage to obey even when it is difficult, and faith to stand firm even when I don't understand. May I not return to old patterns, but may my mind be constantly renewed by your presence and your truth. Lord, I present before you every need. For those who are mentally tired, it brings rest now. For those who face anxiety, fear, or confusion, establish your peace that surpasses all understanding, as it is written in Philippians 4:6-7. Do not be anxious about anything, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. For those who are sick, it brings healing. For those facing financial difficulties, it releases provision. For wounded families, it pours out reconciliation and restoration. At this moment, in silence, I place before you that which is deepest in my heart, my worries, my fears, my desires, that which no one else sees but the Lord knows completely. Father, I commend everything into your hands. I surrender my mind, my thoughts, my decisions, and my future. May your will prevail over mine, because I trust that your plans are perfect. As your word says in Proverbs 16:3, commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established. May it be so in my life. And now, Lord, I rest in this assurance. You are in control. Nothing escapes your gaze, nothing escapes your care. May your peace invade my mind, may your presence envelop me, and may my life reflect all that you are doing within me. If this prayer represents what is in your heart, declare in faith. Amen. In Jesus' name, amen. Throughout this journey, something deep has been built within you. It wasn't just information, it was transformation. Each teaching revealed that surrendering the mind to God is not a distant idea, but a daily, practical, and powerful decision. It is in thought that everything begins. It is in the mind that battles are won or lost. And today you have been given keys that can completely change the way you live, feel, and decide. This message is for you, not by chance, but because God has chosen you to hear it today. Maybe no one sees what happens inside your mind, but God sees, understands, and wants to rule this place. Now the question that remains is, what are you going to do with all this? Will you continue to entertain the same thoughts, or will you decide from today on to surrender your mind completely to God? I am very happy to know that we are together so far, because it shows that there is something being awakened within you. And you are part of it. You are not just a spectator. You are part of a journey of faith that grows every day. So let me invite you to a simple but very special moment. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell if you haven't already. And more than that, I want to meet you. Comment below from where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you have been experiencing. Your story matters, and we can form a chain of faith here where lives are touched and strengthened. And there's something you need to know. It doesn't end here. What you receive today is just the beginning. In the next video, we're going to dive even deeper into a level of understanding that can open your eyes in a way you never imagined. There is a next step, and it may be just what you need to consolidate all of this within your life. Don't miss this sequence, because each part is connected and prepared to take you to a new spiritual level. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.